Morning, good afternoon, everyone. I think we could slowly start our information session. I would like to warmly welcome you to the session on the proposed indicators for evaluating the effectiveness of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And this session is a part of a new initiative, which we call Minamata Online, a series of webinars to present Minamata Convention, its activities and latest science on Mercury, and to provide engagement opportunities to parties and stakeholders. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic continues to challenge the world as we know it. It affects international cooperation as no or limited physical meetings are currently possible, and it shapes new ways of doing business, pushing many activities online. While there is no substitute to collaboration, intergovernmental collaboration to physical meetings, online meetings present additional opportunities for information exchange, learning, and connecting people. The first season of Minamata Online attempts to harness this opportunity with the intention to plan season sessions also next year, based on the experience gained, needs of the parties, and in collaboration and coordination with our major partners. Now, let me a little bit introduce the topic of today's session, and I will start with the topic of the effectiveness evaluation. The first effectiveness evaluation of the convention is to be done by 2023. According to Article 22 of the Convention, the effectiveness evaluation will include information on the level of implementation of the Convention, based on reporting by parties on the measures taken and effectiveness of such measures, and this reporting is due by end of December 2021. Effectiveness evaluation will also cover or include comparable monitoring data on mercury levels in the environment and vulnerable human populations. And thirdly, it will include other available scientific, environmental, technical, financial, and economic information, such as reports of the Compliance and Implementation Committee and information on the operation of the financial assistance, technology transfer, and capacity building arrangements. The agreed purpose of the evaluation has been defined as assessing the overall effectiveness of the Convention at the global level based on the objective of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. As decided by the third conference of the parties in 2019, the work has started with development of monitoring guidance to maintain harmonized, comparable information on mercury levels in the environment, and of a report on mercury trade, supply and demand, including mercury waste flows and stocks. The work is also ongoing on indicators for the first effectiveness evaluation, which is the topic of today's session, hosted by my colleague Claudia from the Secretariat. The next conference of the parties on 1st to 5th November 2021 in Bali, Indonesia, is expected to consider and possibly decide on a set of indicators for the first effectiveness evaluation. And to this end, the Secretariat will prepare a document on indicators to the COP. And I would like to encourage parties to actively take part in the process that starts with the session today, and which will be followed by next steps to be presented shortly, to share your ideas, views, and proposals, and use the process to start reaching a common understanding on a suitable and fit-for-purpose set of indicators. The Secretariat is ready to support you in this task as much as we can, and while this is a party-driven process, stakeholders may wish to present the input too. And before I stop, I would like to extend my special welcome to our guest today, Michael Spilsbury, who is a director in the Evaluation Office of UNEP, joining us to present on effectiveness evaluation and indicators. Michael has extensive experience in doing effectiveness evaluation, so I would like to thank you for your willingness to share your experience with us. And thank you very much, and over to you, Claudia.
Thank you very much, Monika. Hello, good morning, good afternoon to all of you out there. We see a very long list of names and are very happy to have you with us. many names, of course, that we know, and also some newer names. So we're very pleased indeed to have you with us. You may know that this morning we already had one session, so this is the second time today that we're presenting this information. And all of this information will, of course, be made available later on in terms of the PowerPoints and also the recording on our website. I'd just like to point out that indeed, as you might have seen in the chat, we are recording this afternoon's event. So we hope you're okay with that. We'd also like to encourage you to, of course, participate through the question and answers at the end of the session if you would like to. So please use the question and answer category or function, more correctly said, that you would be able to see. There's also the chat function, but if it goes to the question and answers, then we'll absolutely be able to see it at the right time. With that, let me just perhaps go to the next slide, which is just the one that says that we are here today, of course, to look at the proposed indicators. This is part of the work on the arrangements for the effectiveness evaluation of the Mercury Convention. This work, as many of you know, and some of you have even been involved with very deeply, is work that has accumulated, that has built up over some years now. So we had a very rich moment with a lot of information that has already been compiled, and we have some more work to do until COP3. And specifically on indicators, as Monika said, that's what we'll be focusing on today and now indeed. But let me just walk you through what we have in mind for this afternoon. First, we will sort of zoom out a bit and look at what does it mean, effectiveness evaluations. And as Monika said, we have Michael with us, which is really nice indeed, and I'll hand over to him in a second. But while we're zooming out, we also want to take you just through the objective of the Minamata Convention, and therefore in also many ways, the objective of an effectiveness evaluation. I'll then step you through the logic of the Minamata Convention as drafted over the years that many of you have been involved in. And then I'd like to speak to you about implementation and change over time. After that, we'll look more deeply into where we are right now with regard to the work and the outcome of COP3 and what we need to do after COP3. I'll be explaining the plan of work now and over the next 6.5 months, and then take you a little bit into the proposed indicators. All in all, you'll see questions along the way. So there are a couple of questions we'll be posing you, but in many ways, we hope that the session is going to give you a lot of food for thought in your own considerations as parties and stakeholders as well, in terms of the indicators before you. And at the end, we hope that you will be sufficiently resourced to consider the work ahead. But with that, I'd like to invite Michael, please. And just to say that one of the reasons why we're so happy that we have Michael with us today is that the work of our convention in terms of effectiveness evaluation was in previous mandates there was the call that it would have to conform to the standards of evaluation of the United Nations System Evaluation Group. And so from that perspective, it's very nice to have Michael with us today. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Claudia and Monika, for the introduction. Yes, I'll just make a few remarks from my perspective in the Evaluation Office of UNEP. So if we move to the next slide, I'll just give a very brief intro to what the perspective I'm talking from the Evaluation Office. So yeah, I'm the director of the Evaluation Office in UNEP, and we do lots of evaluations, and we do them all in line, as Claudia was saying, with the norms and standards for evaluation in the UN system. My office works independently of the management of UNEP and does about 30+ evaluations a year with a mandate to look at all the projects and programs within UNEP's program of work. But our mandate doesn't extend to the UNEP administered conventions, but we're always happy to help out with the work of our UNEP colleagues. So all the evaluations that my office conducts look at effectiveness amongst other standard criteria, which include relevance, efficiency, impact, and sustainability, i.e. the durability of the effects of UNEP work. So if we move on to the slide, let's talk about a few issues. move to the next slide. That are key in thinking about designing and implementing an evaluation. And the first of these is defining what evaluators call the evaluand, the thing that you're going to evaluate, and actually defining and bounding it is a key decision. You can imagine if you scope an evaluation very narrowly, you can look at things in a lot of depth. But if you scope things incredibly broadly, then the depth that you can examine things and evaluate is much shallower. So it's striking a balance here between the scope, the depth, and the breadth. And a key thing in an effectiveness evaluation is to examine and understand the intentionality that's associated with that. We're looking at effectiveness, so we're looking at causes and effects and attributing effects to the causes. So this issue of understanding intentionality is really important, and I'll come back to that with a few remarks in a minute. But I just wanted to point out a few issues around evaluations in general, and these are commonly discussed in the UN Evaluation Group. We think about the credibility, legitimacy, and utility of evaluation. And of course, credibility relates to the quality, the rigor, and the impartiality and independence and transparency of an evaluation process. So impartiality and independence are really critical. You can imagine that if you have a vested interest conducting an evaluation, the findings may not be regarded as credible by other stakeholders. So this is why in UNEP my office is independent of the management, so that we have the freedom to express our views, speak truth to power, if you like, and try and be impartial in the evaluations that we do. Legitimacy relates to things like following due process, making sure that different views are represented and that the evidence base is based on sound science, good information. So credibility and legitimacy are key attributes in any evaluation, and they come together to enhance the utility. So to be useful, an evaluation has to be relevant and timely, but it also has to have these qualities of credibility and legitimacy. You can imagine if you regard the findings of an evaluation as not credible or legitimate, it's not going to be used. So these are sort of bigger picture considerations around how you set up and manage and conduct an evaluation. So move to the next slide. And this relates to how science, so a lot of the discussion in this webinar is going to be about indicators and science and how that relates to monitoring and ultimately evaluation. So science, of course, underpins robust monitoring, and monitoring underpins credible evaluation. Science obviously is, there's many realms of science, and we're looking in effectiveness evaluation to understand how change happens in the real world, and various dimensions of science are relevant to understanding that. So biophysical, economic, social, behavioral sciences can all play a part in doing a robust and credible effectiveness evaluation. And science, of course, underpins evaluation approaches and methods themselves. So classic example that we're all familiar with right now, things like randomized control trials, which are an evaluative method being used in assessing whether vaccines are efficient and effective. But in this effectiveness evaluation in Minamata, I'm sure that there'll be a variety of different methods and approaches that come together to shape the whole evaluative approach to the convention, the effectiveness of the convention. And I'd just like to speak a little bit about theory of change models, which can be a useful organizing framework to understand the evaluand and to allow different multidisciplinary science to be sort of positioned in a conceptual framework. And that's useful for both management of actions and designing monitoring systems, and of course later evaluation. So you can just move to the next slide. Just a quick graphic here of a very standardized change pathway where you have actions taking place and outputs and outcomes leading towards the intended impacts, which in this slide are environmental impacts, either in terms of reduced threats or environmental benefits, but they could just as easily be framed in health terms. And you'll see along the way you have, you can't really see that they're arrows, but they are arrows moving from one level to the next. And there are various factors that can increase the likelihood that you move from one outcome to another. And there are various assumptions, conditions that must hold for that change to happen. So this is just a graphic representation of a change pathway, and there can be many of these change pathways in an evaluand that you try to assess. And of course, for each of these boxes or arrows, you might come up with indicators. So when you're thinking about an evaluation, it's a real luxury if you can base that evaluation on a very comprehensive and robust monitoring framework. So let's just move to the final slide, which is just putting these things all together. I mean, you very seldom just have one change pathway when you're trying to create effects in the real world. You have many actions coming together to realize the intended impact. So I know that's true for the Minamata Convention, many different actions being taken in different dimensions that ultimately link to the change that you want to see in the real world. So I guess the point of putting this slide up is just to say, well, you know, in designing an effectiveness evaluation, coming back to the original point that I made, you need to bound and frame what it is you're going to look at. And so that means understanding how change happens across all the different provisions within the Minamata Convention. So I'll stop there. That's just very big picture stuff. And I'll leave my colleagues to drill down into the detail. And they've got lots of interesting things to say. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike, and also for taking us to that higher level. I'm going to stay just for a little bit still at that higher zoomed out level, but also just to say I'll call on my dear colleague Eisaku a little bit later on as well to also make some contributions. And I want to just say thank you to Tak, whom you might not be seeing, but who's keeping it all together at the background behind us. But should you have any technical problems, please just reach out directly to Tak. So with that, we go to the next slide, and as indicated, I wanted to spend a moment on what is the objective of the Minamata Convention. Basically, it is the target. Why did the drafters of the Minamata Convention draw up this document, draw up this convention, and why did so many countries come together to sign it and to ratify it? Well, the objective captured in Article 1 is simply, and it's one objective, to protect the human health and the environment from anthropogenic emissions and releases of mercury and mercury compounds. Why do I bring it up now so early in this presentation? Well, quite simply, but for the reason that if we look at the purpose of an effective evaluation, or effectiveness evaluation of the Minamata Convention, then of course it must draw immediately to the reason for why we have established this convention in the first place, and to look at, is it effectively pursuing the purpose for which it was established. Moving on to the next slide. Let me take you a little bit, and I'll stay at a conceptual level, through the logic of the Minamata Convention as it was put together by the drafters. Now, on the left-hand side is a box that I've termed control measures, and you will see in there, as your eye goes from the light gray to the middle, darker gray, and then to the yellow, of course, the numbers of our articles in the life cycle approach that the drafters have put together this convention. Very colloquially speaking, I've termed the first one to keep mercury in the ground. One of the intents of our convention is simply to stop mining of mercury, and that is done through two different paragraphs in Article 3. The one is to prohibit the opening of new mines, and the other one is to set a timeline by which existing mines would cease their operations. In other words, very clear intent of action to bring about a change and to ensure that more mercury stays underground. Moving on to the gray part, and as your eye moves down, you see that each of these articles or paragraphs, as indicated, is one way or a set of ways, a set of interactions, a set of measures to reduce the use and presence of mercury in our economy, in our industry, and in our society. So in terms of Article 3.5a, in terms of the stocks that we have, or B, in terms of the excess mercury from decommissioned chloralkali facilities. And then, as you know very well, many of you, the articles or the paragraphs around the trade of mercury, where while the trade of mercury itself is not prohibited, there are regulatory processes in place, there are control mechanisms in place to, in many ways, turn down the taps or turn off the taps on mercury in our trading system. Of course, there are also, as mercury is part of products and processes, you know, the convention takes well in terms of, and the annexes in this regard, in terms of the products that this convention looks at, in terms of the processes it looks at, and the timelines attached with it, as is with ASGM. And moving to the last three, interim storage, mercury waste and disposal, of course, and contaminated sites. Which brings me to the very nicely bright yellow part, because of course, overall, the logic of the Minamata Convention is to reduce the amount of anthropogenic mercury into the environment. And there, the two foundational articles are the 8 on emissions and 9 on releases. So put together, everything in that box is some kind of intervention or sets up a complex set of interventions or requirements for countries and others to take to make progress towards the overall goal of minimizing, reducing, etc., mercury. Next to it is another box that is as important as these control measures. All of the articles, and as your eye goes down, I'm sure you will see all the logic of why they are spaced and in ways sequenced in that way, namely all of the articles around enabling and support, the enabling and supportive context that countries need, that parties need, both in terms of their national work, but also to be able to cooperate at an international level to bring about, to work towards the aims of our convention. So we, of course, work from a matter of the Article 13 on the financial mechanism, both in terms of what countries themselves are investing in their own ability to regulate, to minimize, to control mercury in their own national context, but also those that are in a position to do so, to make money available and resources available through other means to help others in their work on mercury, or indeed if you are an eligible country and can tap into the different forms of support out there, whether it's our financial mechanism or other types of bilateral and so aid. And this then follows the logic further in terms of knowledge, in terms of capacity building and technical assistance. And as your eye goes down, information exchange, public information, research, etc. All the way down to not only the effectiveness evaluation, which is the subject of our webinar now and a series of different interactions over the last weeks, but also the role of the Conference of the Party, the Secretariat, and others. In total, this slide tends to show you basically how the convention is structured, both on the one hand for action, for interventions, for measures, and on the other hand for all the support that is required to push all of these actions forward. May I have the next slide? This is, I call it one of my favorite pictures, and I'm sure many of you recognize it immediately. It comes from the trade report, the last trade report on mercury. And it really very well sets out these pathways of action and therefore also pathways of change to follow on to what Mike outlined earlier. You will see here the geologic reserves of mercury that would be tapped into through mining and other activities, and then how, if if we disrupt that part, then a pathway of mercury coming in our economy is, of course, disrupted and interfered with. And then in the middle section, the logic of the mercury supply, whether it is through trade or products or in artisanal small-scale gold mining or industrial processes. And again, how here the use of mercury or the substitution for other processes or other means is again intervened and is influenced to bring about change. And then lastly, towards the right of that picture, you see that, of course, mercury that then is no longer used in some ways, either is no longer used productively in the economic or industrial or other setup or safely stored, does end up finding its sink, whether it is in the environment through releases or emissions, or in other ways. And so this is one of the diagrams which I'm sure you've also looked at, but it's one of the very easy diagrams to really see how the logic of the way the convention was put together, but also how we, looking into this this task before us in terms of the effectiveness evaluation, can look at pathways of change. If I may have the next slide. I want to spend a bit of time, or a little bit of time, just on the difference between implementation and change, but both happen over time. To achieve the objective of the convention is of course not a quick journey. It's an iterative approach, and it's a long-term goal. Countries and others have signed up for a long-term endeavor to reduce the amount of mercury that is in our economy and our environment, and of course also affecting health. The drafters of the Minamata Convention very clearly knew the direction of intent that they had in mind. And so they laid out essentially a roadmap of action. And as outlined before, there are all of the control mechanisms, but then also those supportive or contextual means as well to support this work going forward. But it's not enough just to have a roadmap. As we know, when we go on our journeys, we also need to track the progress of our journey of change. And we need a type of dashboard to see where we are. Whether it is a matter of our GPS of how far am I away from the target, or whether it is a matter of how quickly am I going? Am I going slowly? Am I going speedily? Of course, one has to know, do I have all my reserves, my energies with me? Am I on a low tank or a higher tank? Do I have what I need to establish the change conditions that I'm looking for? And lastly, the last icon there under gauges and dashboard, time. How am I doing on time? And on this one of the very good things that are built into the Minamata Convention are, of course, also the timelines by which action is supposed to have been taken, and by which certain changes are supposed to be in place. I also do want to just point out that, of course, even the best plan may run into challenges, and this is completely normal. And so even with the Minamata Convention, although it has been born under a very good start so far and done incredibly well, I would say, there may well be times when the Minamata community will have to look at something that might not be progressing as quickly as intended, or something that might need more help, or something that needs a bit more consideration. So this is also part of the journey, the constant perspective of how well are we doing, and do we need to maybe press on a button a bit more. Moving to the next slide, I'd like to spend a little bit of time just on this differentiation between tracking the progress of implementation versus tracking the progress on change. So on the left-hand side is a box, I'm very aware of it, and looking at those that have joined us today. Many of you have worked on your national reports that you have submitted. Just on this note, we have a 78% submission rate of our parties for the reports that came in December, which is phenomenal. So thank you very, very much to all the parties for such a tremendous effort to do so. The national reports, and the icon is supposed to try to show that, is really about what does that country, what does that party do and how is it progressing vis-a-vis its implementation on Mercury. So it's very much a report on that country. This report is of course shared with the COP to look at how the family of parties are doing in terms of implementing the provisions of the convention. According to the decision that laid out the timing and format of this report, which was passed in COP1, biannually we will receive information from parties on their level of progress, their level of implementation at a national level, because there are short reports that come every 4 years, and the first year was at the end of 2019 with 4 questions, and then the next biennium will be the full format, which is 43 questions. And just to sort of prepare you a little bit for the rest of the presentation, also as we will move more into indicators, I just wanted to point out that if you look at the questions that are in that agreed format, 32 of the questions are on what I've termed control measures of the convention, while 11 are on enabling and supportive context type of articles. And I leave you there also just with a quick reference to Article 15, because implementation and the progress in implementation, and perhaps at times even difficulties that might arise for a country and how it tries to address such difficulties, that is of course all also within the purview of the work of the Implementation and Compliance Committee. But moving now to the other side of the screen, where I'd like to speak a little bit about tracking the progress of change that the Minamata Convention is supporting. And here with the icon, it's not about individual countries. As the icon is trying to show, it's countries putting together, it's parties putting together their information that in an aggregated way will be a way for the convention, the family of the convention, to reflect on its ability and its progress of driving forward this change. And this is the heart and soul of why we have an effectiveness evaluation and what is outlined in Article 22. Much of the text which I have paraphrased here, you know it well, so I shall not go in depth into it. But the reason why I put both of these here together is to really make the point that tracking implementation and tracking change, while very closely related, are not the same thing. And lastly, just to say that a lot of the very, very good information we will be getting through the national reports will help us and will inform the effectiveness evaluation. But again, it is only one of, or it's a source of information. It is not the same process. It is almost as if there are 2 ways of looking at the work of the convention. Moving along to the next slide, and now going a little bit deeper and directly into indicators, I just wanted to spend a moment on the outcome of COP3 and the status quo of work on the effectiveness evaluation now. Many of you know, many of you have been involved, and many of you have been following that the convention has been working on providing itself with the arrangements, or setting up the arrangements to provide itself with the support it requires to, in fact, do the effectiveness evaluations of the convention. And so there's quite a lot of information that has come through COP1, COP2. There was a group that had a mandate that went over 2 intersessional processes, and so there's a richness of information already put together. With that then comes that in November of last year comes Decision 310, that is not a very long decision and not a very detailed decision, but it points to 3 areas of work that are to be done intersessionally in this regard. And here in this slide, I've outlined it differently, just in color. The first one is that the first paragraph of the decision looks at the work on the proposed, or requests work on the proposed indicators, and the rest of our afternoon will now be spent on the indicators. But the second part, or the A of the second paragraph, is on the work on developing monitoring guidance. And I'll ask Eisaku to speak to that in a moment for those that have been joining us for all of these events so far, you will have seen that we always try to keep both sides of this work informed of what is happening in the other stream. And lastly, there are also some other reports which will be under development. If you would like to know any of the information on any of this work, I've put a screenshot there of our website under intersessional processes. We post all of the information in a hopefully accessible way with hyperlinks, etc. Please visit there to find out how we are progressing on all of that, besides, of course, staying with the rest of this webinar. But if I could maybe invite Eisaku just to lead us a little bit through the work that he's leading on developing monitoring guidance. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Claudia. And I'm briefly explaining where we stand with the another work stream on the use of monitoring data, including the webinar we convened on Tuesday this week, as you see on the screen. And next slide, please. I'm referring to the provision of the Article 22, as Claudia showed just now, which states that the monitoring information is part of the basis of the effectiveness evaluation, and COP shall establish arrangements for providing itself with comparable monitoring data on the presence and movement of mercury in the environment and trends in levels of mercury observed in biotic media and vulnerable populations. And also this work is based on the COP decision MC3/10 that requests the Secretariat to advance the work by securing services for drafting guidance on monitoring. In this roadmap, there are three color schemes. Orange color refers to the development of an annotated outline. The Secretariat drafted the annotated outline and posted it on the website for comments, and the finalization process is underway. The blue color scheme shows the drawing on scientific expertise to create the content of the monitoring guidance. And experts were identified by parties and stakeholders to contribute to the drafting. The first webinar was done on Tuesday this week, and thematic webinars follow in the September-December timeframe. And green color scheme refers to the consultation with parties and stakeholders that happens next year. Next slide, please. And this slide just reproduces the chapters in the draft annotated outline. Chapter 3 on introduction and objectives will explain the objectives of the document, which is to support the arrangements for providing a COP with comparable monitoring data for the effectiveness evaluation. Chapter 4 will discuss the use of monitoring data in informing indicators on the level of mercury in the environment and vulnerable populations for the purpose of the effectiveness evaluation. And the chapter will discuss how the data can be aggregated to understand the overall level of mercury, geographical patterns, temporal trends, and environmental and health risk. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 explains air, biota, human biomonitoring, and discuss characterization of monitoring sites, sampling, measurements, quality assurance, and so on. But I'm not going into all the details and give it back to Claudia. Thanks.
As you can see, we are quite excited about all of this work and could speak about this for a very long time. But I do want to make sure that we get as much information to you about indicators this afternoon. So let me take you right into that work. The plan of work, as you'll see on the next slide, for the work on indicators was not actually set out in the paragraph in the decision. The decision simply said invites parties to submit views on the indicators that are in Annex 1 to the present decision and request the Secretariat to bring those views to the fourth meeting of the Conference of the Parties. Because it didn't explain or set out the roadmap or the program of how to submit views through the Executive Secretary and with the Bureau. The Secretariat worked on a draft plan of work to enable it to support parties indeed to develop their views for submission to the Secretariat, and that we can then bring it to the attention of the Conference of Parties. This is the plan of work that we have in front of us. I would like to say that the indicators that we'll spend more time on now have been, there are many indicators, and there has been a lot of time spent on these indicators, but it was just not ready yet or finished yet by the time of COP3. And so this time that we have in the run-up of COP4, we as Secretariat would like to support you as parties as much as possible in an iterative way in that regard. So with that as background, it is a three-step process that we have laid out, that we lay out for you, that we invite you to be part of, as Monika said. After this session, which is basically today to try to give you as many impulses of thought and extra information that may assist you in your considerations of those indicators. After that, following the session, parties are invited to consider what are their initial views and responses to these proposed indicators, and to prepare those and to submit those to the Secretariat by the 30th of November. And as Monika indicated, stakeholders are also, of course, very welcome to submit their views too. The Secretariat will take all of the submissions that we will be receiving by the 30th of November and make them available on a dedicated digital workspace by middle of December, so that you as parties and stakeholders have a way to look at what the others are thinking or saying, or verbalizing or presenting in terms of their initial views on this work. We will also be preparing a document on reviewing the available data and methods for quantified assessment, and should there be a need as coming forward through the views or responses or expressions that we receive by the end of November, can, as a Secretariat, of course, make supplementary information available if you require it. So in roughly 6.5 weeks, we hope to have these initial views, and as mentioned, we hope very much that you will find some of the information, conceptual information that we have in our session today, helpful in this regard. Once these initial views are in and you are able to look at them on the digital workspace, we would like to help facilitate an exchange session by the end of January next year on all of the materials received, all of the views received, and the responses. This exchange, which is maybe a little bit different envisioned than today, where we are providing information, this exchange is really supposed to be the opportunity for parties to understand from each other, clarify perhaps what they read in the submissions or in the responses, and perhaps have additional questions that might have been triggered or that were lingering and never really found a place yet to be answered, or any other relevant information sharing and exchange that you may have that might be useful to your own considerations on the proposed indicators. The idea very much is that that exchange session will allow you to, as parties, just to have an additional way of reaching out to the family of Minamata parties, and in that way allow you to prepare your more formal preparation of views. And that would bring us to the third stage, which is the deadline for the submission to the Secretariat of the views of parties by the 31st of March. By that stage, basically, we will have spent about 6.5 months on this process of looking at the indicators, and all of the submissions that we receive, we will then, as Secretariat, compile and complete as a document for preparation for COP4. I just want to highlight here, of course, that as an official document that goes to COP4, it goes into the editing process, it goes into the preparation process, and as such, that document would be coming out in September, as would all the other documents in preparation of the COP in November next year in Bali. With that, let me take you deeper, indeed, on the proposed indicators. And with the next slide, I would firstly like to draw your attention to what is bordered in black. And just give you, perhaps some of you haven't spent that much time on the indicators, or perhaps some of you haven't looked at it lately, just a quick transversal sort of what is in these indicators. So just by numbers, there are 58 proposed indicators in Annex 1. And some of them are cross-referenced with an indicative list of monitoring indicators as well. And those monitoring indicators, those 7 monitoring indicators, can be found in the document, the report from the expert group that worked last year to the COP3. So that report is found in, that is document 14 that for the COP of last year. It is also very useful to, or it's also very important to outline that the indicators as proposed in the annex are currently differentiated into 3 types, or are grouped under 3 names, namely process indicators. Those are the most of them, 44 of them. 12 of the indicators are described or named outcome indicators, and then monitoring indicators, 2 are in that annex, and then plus the 7 that I mentioned earlier, this indicative list that is in the document 314. Also just to note that some of these indicators were further differentiated and named as either overall process indicators or overall outcome indicators or cross-cutting indicators. And then there are even a couple that are called additional indicators. We differentiate that they might not be core, but they would be additional or supplementary to the work. I also want to point out that the indicators that are in Annex 1 are grouped into specific clusters, and this was very much part of the mandate or the request from the COP prior to have the indicators follow some kind of integrated approach. And so there are indicators that are clustered around the supply articles, the demand articles, the pressure articles, in other words, all of those control measures. And then there are also indicators that are around a cluster on support and another cluster on information and research. I would like to mention that there are a couple of indicators that are not inside a cluster, most prominently the very first one, because it relates to the objective and was seen as being standalone and important and overarching, and so needed to have its own space. There are also a couple of indicators in that annex that are, again, not completely clustered, but are on their own. But some reflections on the right-hand side and some notes if one peruses the long list of indicators. The one is just to note that there really are many proposed indicators, and this is quite natural because the request from the COP was to go article by article and look at possible indicators. So you have a very rich table of indicators to look at for your consideration. Here and there, an indicator, one has to wonder if there needs to be a bit of sharpening in terms of what the target, the performance target was we were after with a particular indicator. And this refers very much back to also how Mike showed us that indicators are, of course, on a chain of change. It can also be said that here and there might be an indicator where the direction of change is not completely clear, or could be made clearer. So there are some indicators that on second reading or on reading after a little bit of time could be sharpened that way. Under typology, it might be worth noting that a number of the process indicators to measure actions show how we are progressing in implementation, but there are also those that are actually supposed to give more input, not just in terms of outputs or outcomes, but higher level impacts. What are the higher level impacts of the measures that are adopted and are signed up for under the convention? I also want to, in yellow, just draw your attention to what I've already mentioned, actually, that the supply, demand, and pressure clusters are essentially the control mechanism, the control measures, while that are found along the pathways of change, while the support, information, and research cluster and a couple of others that are not cluster per se, are more from the enabling supporting context. Moving to the next slide. So before going deeper into how to perhaps prepare or present views on the indicators, it seems it's important that we contextualize in which context we are supposed to be, and in which context we as Secretary can help you consider the indicators. The effectiveness evaluation was intended to be set around a certain set of policy questions. The first of those questions was, have parties taken action to implement the convention? The second policy question was, have the actions resulted in changes in the supply and use of mercury? And also, have those actions resulted in changes in the emissions and releases of mercury? And thirdly, a policy question was, have those changes in turn resulted in changes in the level of mercury in the environment, in biotic media and vulnerable people? In other words, a sequencing of outcome to impact. Overall, as pointed out at the beginning, the objective is to understand, is the convention effective at meeting its objective of protecting human health and the environment from anthropogenic mercury? Mike already outlined very well all of the key words that we need to be mindful of in evaluations, but let me just draw your attention to outputs followed by outcome, and then of course impact, which is what overall at the end a convention like ours, but all the others are after as well. In other words, to impact, to make lasting change, to really bring about a difference. Indicators, crucially, show whether that change happened, the change that was anticipated. And so indicators demonstrate progress towards that specific outcome or progress along a pathway of that change. So, moving on. Looking at the indicators we have, I've prepared a couple of cases and I will conclude on that. Just 5 short questions to perhaps pique your interest in looking deeper at the indicators and perhaps also to inform your way of looking at the indicators in the preparation of your views. In this particular case, B1, the indicator B1, it might be valid to ask if this is not one of those indicators where we need to sharpen the language a little bit. It reads, proportion of parties that have implemented key provisions under this cluster. So a question could be, what are the key provisions? Is that sufficiently clear? Is that understood? Another example is indicator 2.3 that goes, global use of mercury in the manufacturing of products and processes in tons per application. Now, many of you are supporting also the intersessional process and following the intersessional process on Annex A and B. And so per application in itself might not, you will know well, might not be perhaps the clearest and sharpest way of making an indicator on that type of work. Moving to the second case. In part, at times, reading the indicators, one has to ask, one comes across some indicators where it's not entirely sure if something is overlapping, is something being repeated, or is it really necessary to look at this item from 3 different places? And here, the ones around mercury trade, B4, B7, and B8, I've pasted as example. The one reads amount of mercury traded, broken down by specific purpose. It's an important, of course, information point. Another is number and proportion of parties trading in mercury. Well, that's the different view on that. And the last one, volume of mercury being traded. But is this the best way of looking at this set of information? By asking this question, I'm not meaning to say that these have to be changed. It is just, well, it's just for your consideration. Are these the kind of things that could maybe be sharpened a bit or perhaps put together? to be able to be real indicators of progress, of change for the overall convention. The third case, on the next slide, at times one would maybe have to wonder, are we setting out an indicator of progress? So let me read this one, which is B12. Number of parties with facilities for final disposal of waste containing mercury or mercury compounds. Is it a success if after some years the Minamata Convention can report that we have facilities for final disposal in all parties? Is that itself a consideration of success? Or would the convention family prefer to have some really good, accessible facilities for final disposal of waste, irrespective of national? Here, it is not necessarily entirely clear if really, as written now, many more or a higher number is in itself a better measure of success. Moving to case 4. In this one, let me read the indicator. It says number of exemptions per product category that are still valid. As you know, exemptions are possible, and this is one of the indicators that has been drafted, and it is an important source of or point of information to understand how exemptions are being used. But if, for example, a country has become a member of the club, has ratified and is now bound by many other parts of many other obligations, isn't that a good outcome, and isn't that making the overall effort more effective? Because by doing this exemption, that country came on board. Again, this is not to say to make the judgment on whether or not this is the best indicator, but just to ask, is this one of the core indicators that we need to look at the pathway of change, or is it an important information point that the convention would like to have as a reference to understand how the convention is working? And lastly, this is perhaps an important one to really just absorb and look at. How are we going to look at the information we require to be able to speak to policy question 3? Have those changes resulted in changes in levels of mercury in the environment, biotic media, and vulnerable people that can be attributable to the convention? There are 2 indicators, A1 and G1, and you can read them here. But is this enough? Are these 2 indicators, is this enough for the convention to be informed, to be able to answer this question, which is one of the important questions on its overall journey to understand its progress of change? With that, and I'm very mindful of the time, my apologies, I just leave you with one last question, which is perhaps when going through the indicators, the parties may be served well by looking at the criteria that will help to refine and sharpen the proposed indicators that the COP will choose for itself for this effectiveness evaluation. Thank you very much, and we would look forward to any questions or clarifications you might have in this regard. Thank you. And I just want to say, Eisaku, thank you for helping me on this part, which is if there were any questions that have come forward so far or Q&As that we bring them forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And ladies and gentlemen, we only have 2 minutes, but I think it may be okay to extend 5 or 10 minutes. I encourage you to type in your questions, and we already received 3 questions. One about the one question is that I imagine there will be a reduction in mercury in the environment, not just because of the Minamata Convention, but because of the global economy shutting down due to COVID-19. How will the effectiveness evaluation account for this? And I already responded in chat that it is a matter of policy question 3, which is something that is being addressed in the effectiveness evaluation process. So I think I will move to this 3rd one we received, which is a very interesting question. In many cases, developing countries do not have the baseline against which one can indicate changes. So what will be the indicator in such cases? I think this is a very interesting and important question. I'd like to invite Claudia to address this one. Thanks.
Thank you, Eisaku. This baseline question is important and is at the crux of many things. And I think there is, I think it's the slide right after this that I wouldn't mind having. Yes, which is also where at the very bottom I make, I point to thresholds in terms of that thresholds identify the point at which an outcome is met or not met. This question has been, was part of the work of the expert group, and in many ways the baselines were regarded or were put in the document as just being whatever is in the first effectiveness evaluation and work from there. I think baselines is really one of the topics that maybe we do need a little bit of extra time on, both to understand better what is what the different understandings of it is, but also specifically to know better what the challenges are, and specifically from developing countries, which I understand very well, may not have all of the indications of the baseline. So while I cannot give you a real answer right now, my point is that this is one of the areas that would do well to have a bit of time on reflection in terms of parties and stakeholders, and could be then looked at more carefully or a little bit deeper during the June interactions. Eisaku, I just want to very shortly just say something about the other question about, does the shutdown, the global slowdown, will it reduce Mercury? Just anecdotally, we see that in times of economic stress and economic uncertainty, that one thing always wins, and that is gold. So the price of gold is not only stable, it is rising. And with a lot of uncertainty, we have seen a lot more activity in many parts of the world around the artisanal small-scale gold mining sector. And so there's actually a fair amount of mercury, presumably, or maybe even already documented, that is perhaps being used more than beforehand, as some are choosing or are forced into taking up this activity. So we have to look at the slowdown in two ways. That is one comment I'd just like to make in this regard. And one other is that we know that while the convention is looking at anthropogenic mercury, we also know that there's legacy mercury and there are re-releases of mercury. So in many ways, it is a task for the monitoring experts, the science experts, to help us understand and differentiate between what are the effects of change of the convention's measures and what are the environmental effects that are part of this curious but wondrous chemical called heavy metal called mercury. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And if I may take one more question, which is from Susan King on direction. And her question is it appropriate for indicators to indicate direction? Since the data could show progress or no progress, for example, the indicator should not say reduction of emissions, but simply emissions, and the data will show increase or reduction. So this is another important, interesting question. Thanks.
Yeah, Susan, I think you've hit something on the head. I have, while looking through, and I know you know this work very, very well, so I know you're very well informed yourself on this topic anyway, and also the how nimble one has to be with formulating the indicator in the right way. But I have seen in some evaluations, speaking now from outside of Minamata, that the direction is not indicated and the data speaks to the direction. I have seen that approach, but then I've also seen in other setups that a direction, an intentionality is indicated. So I wonder if Michael is still with us, if he may have maybe a more enlightening comment in this regard. Thanks, Susan and Eisaku, for that.
I think that's right. It speaks to impartiality, and the intentionality may be expressed in the indicator in terms of desired change, but the data will speak for itself. So you might just have a negative reduction. So it's a good question, but yeah, of course, the credibility will come from robust data.
Thank you, Claudia. And I just cannot resist taking up one more question. Sorry about this, from David Krakenhoft, which is this. The nature of mercury contamination across the world is extremely variable, mercury source type, level of contamination, etc. And thus, one set of prescribed indicators is not likely the best way to perform the effectiveness evaluation. This is very, also this is a very interesting question. Can you address this?
Yes, this is really an interesting and very important question, or a very important observation. It is such that when we put together science, whether we are hardcore scientists or social scientists or whatever scientists that we are, we try to put together something that is robust and something that will meet all the needs, be in the right parameters, be as what Michael showed us at the beginning, the evaluant is identified clearly. It probably is true that we will never have the perfect set of indicators at any set time, but we could have an set of indicator for a time, and we could perhaps make provision that some indicators might need to be added on or graduated out if something is no longer valid. And so I do believe that there isn't anything like a set of indicators. I would imagine, or I would, having now accompanied this process for some time, there are definitely some indicators on the strong pathways of change that just make sense to look at. Is something being changed in terms of trade? Is something being changed in terms of the amount of mercury coming back into the economy? Those are very obvious causalities that we would need to look at. But as Michael also said, it's not only that one intervention will cut the cord or will undo, will bring about the change. Sometimes it's a complex set of steps. Some of them are iterative, some of them are actually perhaps just all of a sudden meeting at the particular point. So I think you've hit on a philosophical question that is behind many evaluations, and there was one of the sources I've been using to guide my own understanding of work was talking about that both indicators and thresholds can or are subjective, and I was almost annoyed to find such a description because I wanted it to be scientific and objective, but there is certainly a certain amount of almost contextual understanding and knowledge that we just have at a certain time, and whether you then call it subjective, I don't know if that word was exactly right. I still don't like it very much, but indicators are in a way also something that we would probably have to look at over time because they also undergo a journey, so to speak. But Michael, maybe if I can ask you if you have a better view or a more comprehensive answer. Or another view.
Well, I can say something. Maybe it's about sampling. When you're designing your effectiveness evaluation, maybe you select different samples to explore, effectiveness in different contexts. The comment in the question is about variation in levels of contamination and so forth. So maybe something for the evaluation to consider is the extent to which it looks at extreme things and the extent to which it looks at outliers. So in any evaluation, you usually try to get a handle on the range of of cases, if you like, and whatever the intervention might be. So, I mean, typically when we're looking at, say, something in natural resource management, we might want to sample different locations around the world where things have worked differently, and get examples of things where things worked well and kind of middle of the road and didn't work at all, and to try and understand and learn. You want to know how things work well and why they worked well, and equally you want to understand why they didn't work so well in other situations. So maybe it's not just about having one set of indicators full stop in the context of performing an evaluation. Maybe it's thinking of the evaluation approach, use the indicators you have, but also think about sampling different situations to try and understand effectiveness better.
So since Eisaku, you said you couldn't resist throwing this question to you, I would actually love to hear what you would reply, because
well, thank you. Thank you. And I totally agree with Mike. I think this is not the one set of indicators full stop, and for example, for monitoring indicators, yes, the level of mercury in the environment is one of the indicators, but I think the COP may need to look into some details if they detect some interesting changes in the environment. So there may be a need to go deeper. So I think this is a kind of a dynamic challenge of the effectiveness evaluation. And with this, I think we received one more question, but I think for the benefit of time, we will need to close it, and I will hand this over to Claudia.
Well, thank you very much, Eisaku, and thank you to all of you for tuning in today, for sharing your perspectives and your questions, because they make us think, of course, and hopefully sharpen our ability to support you as parties and stakeholders on this journey. I would like to close. We are a little bit over time and do apologize for that, but thank you for having stayed, basically almost all of you, until now. Monika has asked me just to thank you very much. She had to step out and could not stay for the remainder of the meeting, but we look forward to having you with our other meetings, as Minamata Online is now a weekly event. So we look forward to having you with us then, and just also to say thank you to Michael for being with us, and Tuck for keeping everything running on the back end. Thank you very much, and should there be other questions that might still come up, please don't hesitate to just send us an email. But the overall hope is that with some of these questions and perspectives that we've shared and heard today, that you as parties have a couple of ways of biting this apple that is in front of you, called proposed indicators. Thank you very much, and wishing you a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.